All right, everyone, this is Caitlin Sellis. I just wanted to welcome you all to today's webinar. Just a reminder, please be sure to keep your mics muted if you are not speaking. If you have any questions today, please feel free to enter them into the chat box. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kathy.
Great. Well, welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Kathy Ramstetter, and I am a member of the Board of Directors for American School Health Association. Some people call us ASHA, some people call us ASHA, and I tended to go between the two. But I've been a member with ASHA for about 10 years now, and it is a place where people who are engaged with schools, whether they're teachers, administrators, volunteers, school nurses. We do have principals as well, and we were actually started by a pediatrician in the early 1920s. So we have many folks coming around our students, and it's a place where our mission is to really ensure that every student experiences a school that is safe, where they can learn and they can thrive. The students themselves are healthy, prepared to learn every day, and they're nurtured by all those adults around them within that coordinated system of both the school as community, but also the broader community. And this is one experience that you are having today with continuing education around the issues that affect our children in schools and our children more broadly. But we have an annual school health conference. We just finished that in October in Indianapolis, and next year's will be in Cincinnati at the Hyatt Regency. And you can see the dates on your screen of the first week in October, the 2nd to the 4th. And as a native Cincinnatian, I can tell you Cincinnati will have much to offer in addition to lots of learning and networking around issues that affects our children in schools and health and learning. So mark your calendars for that one. Other member benefits for those who are members of ASHA include the Journal of School Health, which is published once a month. It is peer-reviewed, and it's an indexed professional journal, and you can get it both online and in print. And we've been publishing that for almost the life of our association. It's also access to our annual conference, which I just mentioned, our bi-weekly newsletter that we have, and then we do have 4 networking communities within ASHA that focus on specific areas of interest, so you can have kind of a smaller community within our association. And everybody who is listening today will receive 1 continuing credit hour for no cost. That is a benefit to all of our members. So there is a cost to go to our annual conference, but any continuing education that is earned at the conference is free for our members. We also have a career center that both those seeking positions and those who want to post career opportunities can do that posting at a discounted rate if you're a member. And then we have this also really, really unique benefit, I think, is that the American Academy of Pediatrics does offer all of our members a 15% discount on their publications. So that's a really nice benefit to connect that health medical component of children's health to their learning in schools. And I believe it's time for me to be turning this over to Jon. Did I lose you? Oh, there it is. So Jon Macy will be our presenter today. And Jon comes to us from Indiana University, which is actually where American School Health Association is now located. We're right on the property there at Bloomington. So Jon is an associate professor at Indiana University, Bloomington, of Applied Health and Sciences in the School of Public Health at IU. He teaches public health administration, in the Public Health Administration concentration for the Master of Public Health program. His research interests include public health policy and design, implementation, and evaluation of public health interventions. Jon's received a PhD in health behavior from Indiana University, a master's in public health and international health from Emory University, and a Bachelor of Arts in economics from DePaul University. And with that, I'm going to turn you over to the expert today, Dr. Jon Macy.
Hello, thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today about this, I guess, pretty hot topic. about vaping among US teens. This is the outline for today's presentation. I'm gonna just do a quick overview of electronic nicotine delivery systems, or ENDS, talk about some new prevalence data, review some recent research, talk about some of the actions that the Food and Drug Administration has taken over the years and some very recent ones, and then have an opportunity for some questions and answers. What I tried to do was pull together really some of the latest information on this topic. There's a lot going on and a lot of research coming out right now. So hopefully this will be helpful information to you. If you have questions as we go along, feel free to put them into the chat and we'll try to answer them. Or if we have time, then we'll also answer questions. I'll answer some questions at the end. So there's a lot of different terms and words that people throw around that are interchangeable and can get a little confusing with this topic. Some of it makes it difficult when researchers are collecting data, because we don't know what to call these things, because the teenagers and young adults that are using them tend to call them different things. So you've got vaping, which is like, the kind of the behavior, the act of using the electronic nicotine delivery systems. And then e-cigarettes is how when we first started calling them e-cigarettes, but things have kind of evolved from that point. Then there are e-hookahs, or electronic hookahs. And of course, most recently, the hot thing is juuling and Juul pods and using the Juul products. We'll talk about that. And then kind of the, I guess, researcher term is this ENDS, or electronic nicotine delivery system, which is obviously kind of a boring acronym, but sadly that's the way us academics talk, is in boring acronyms too much of the time. But in any case, there's a lot of different words floating around that kind of mean the same thing, kind of don't. So it's important to just have that as some context as I go through the rest of the presentation. So these things come in all shapes and sizes and colors, everything from disposable e-cigarettes to the ones that kind of look like a cigarette, the original e-cigarettes, to these larger kind of cartridge models. There's even electronic cigars and electronic pipes you see here. More recently, what's become more popular is kind of these more streamlined models of, again, ENDS, electronic nicotine delivery systems, that look more like USB flash drives, and that's how, some of them are charged. And that's the Juul, right? So this is just a picture of the Juul with the accompanying Juul pods, and you can see there that little device at the bottom really just looks like a USB computer flash drive. And that's how these are charged. And then the small things wrapped in the plastic are the Juul pods, which is the liquid where the nicotine is stored. And so that's where, as you can see by looking at this, if you haven't seen these already, this is one of the reasons these have become problematic in schools, is that they look like a flash drive that a student would be storing their documents on, and teachers don't necessarily recognize them. So just the look of them has made the Juuls and the Juul pods problematic. But also the look of them, I guess, being sleek and is attractive to teenagers. And so, as we'll see in a minute here, their use is really taken off. So briefly, how they work. Most of these devices have some sort of battery component, or you charge it, like the Juul. They have a heating element and then some sort of reservoir or place to hold a liquid. And you heat them up, and then it produces an aerosol, and that the liquid getting heated up, which contains the nicotine, often various flavorings and other chemicals that help make that aerosol. Once it gets heated up and that aerosol's there, then users inhale it into their lungs. And this is, this behavior, this action of inhaling the aerosol into the lungs is where people are starting to worry about the health effects of these things, which we'll talk about here in a second. The truth of the matter is that we really don't know the long-term health effects of using these devices. They just haven't been around long enough to have long-term epidemiologic studies to know what long-term health effects are. We do know that nicotine has health effects, and the Juul pods and all of these devices are primarily used, not exclusively, but primarily used to get nicotine to your brain. And we know that nicotine's highly addictive. Nicotine can harm adolescent brain development, and that matters because it continues into the early to mid 20s. And then the aerosols, what we talked about in the last slide, can contain harmful substances, some of them carcinogens, and they're inhaled deeply into the lungs. And so it just seems like that inhaling the aerosols deeply into your lungs is potentially problematic, even though we don't have the long-term data that we need to make those conclusions quite yet. And what this is all kind of caused is what I'm calling the great vaping debate. And there are people who feel very strongly, and they're probably right, that for current cigarette smokers, there's probably a public health benefit. If you're a nicotine addicted cigarette smoker, if you switch to e-cigarettes or ends and use them to cut down, or hopefully eventually to quit using cigarettes altogether, and just using that harm reduction approach. However, the problem is that public health benefit will be diminished if e-cigarette use leads to the initiation of combustible cigarette smoking, or what we think of as traditional cigarettes, among adolescents. So that's what we're concerned about. And what's led to is this public health communication challenge. So to current adult smokers, the messaging from a harm reduction perspective is you should probably switch to e-cigarettes, because all evidence that we know so far suggests that they're not as harmful as when you take a combustible cigarette, light tobacco on fire, and breathe that down into your lungs. However, it becomes very tricky when adolescents, teenagers, young adults hear that messaging that e-cigarettes aren't harmful. And to adolescents, we're saying you should not use e-cigarettes because you might someday switch to combustible cigarettes. And that's just hard messaging to deliver, to say to one group it's safer, but to turn around to a different age group and say it's not safe. So that's where I think public health is faced with this challenge of how to communicate this messaging. And it's going to continue to be a challenge until we have the data on the long-term health effects of e-cigarette use and whether or not there really are aiding in current cigarette smokers in quitting tobacco or quitting cigarettes, or if people are just becoming dual users and getting nicotine in a variety of ways. So now to the data. There are a lot of new data that have come out recently from CDC that are, the data are frankly kind of alarming. We've seen a 75% increase in the number of high school students who have used e-cigarettes in the past 30 days. And where we are right now is 20% of high school students report using e-cigarettes, or ENDs. And again, I'm going back and forth on this terminology. But that means 3 million high school students in the United States using electronic cigarettes. And this is what that looks like graphically. And so you can see from 2011 to 2018 that the gray line on that graph has gone all the way from 1.5% all the way to 20%, according to the preliminary data from CDC. So that's a pretty dramatic rise over a 7-year period. On the other hand, with the red line, you see that starting around 16% in 2011, we've gone down, but that decline has kind of leveled off to around 8% over the last couple of years. And so while reducing cigarette smoking among high school students, among adolescents in general in the United States is really a great public health victory, it's going to be difficult to get that line, to keep pushing that line lower, below, down to 7 to 6% to 0, where we would like for it to go. And the real concern here is that, the health effects, the unknown kind of health effects of using electronic cigarettes aside, is that this dramatic increase in e-cigarette use among relatively young teenagers is going to cause that red line to go back up. And I mean, that's really where the public health community and the tobacco control community has a lot of concern, is that the use of the electronic cigarettes, that dramatic increase, is going to result in teenagers switching or using additional nicotine products like cigarettes, and that red line is going to go back up and really undo all of the great work that we've done over the past several years or decades to get cigarette smoking among teenagers down. And this just shows a little bit of recent, just from a couple months ago, market share data that demonstrates just how popular and hot the juuling is, where it's accounting for almost 3/4 of e-cigarette sales, or electronic nicotine delivery system sales, in the month of September. And the other thing to note here is that those smaller pieces of the pie are products sold by the major tobacco companies: British American Tobacco, Altria, and Imperial Tobacco. And so it's just something to note that the large tobacco companies have kind of jumped onto this e-cigarette bandwagon. And so you can kind of draw your own conclusions about what that might mean. So now what I would like to do is kind of dive into some recent research on ENDS use among teens and young adults. There have been several studies that have been published really pretty recently that have looked at specifically the issue of, does electronic cigarette use kind of predict that people are going to move towards cigarette smoking, going back to what I was talking about before, the big concern? Or are they going to start with electronic cigarettes and just kind of stay there, and it won't progress to cigarette smoking? So we finally have had time to do some prospective studies to really dig into this issue and see what's going on. The first study looked at the association of non-cigarette tobacco product use with future smoking among youth in a large national study from a few years ago, and published in JAMA Pediatrics. what this study did is looked at around 10,000 adolescents, 12 to 17 years old, who had reported that they never smoked at baseline at the initial data collection, and then reported their smoking a year later. And what this study aimed to do was they just wanted to see, of those who used non-cigarette tobacco products at baseline, were they more likely to start smoking cigarettes a year later? And this is what they found. So at baseline, of this sample of these 10,000 teenagers, about 4% used e-cigarettes, another 3% reported using hookah, 2% reported using other combustibles like little cigars and pipes and all kinds of things like that. A little under 2% reported using smokeless tobacco. And then a year later, when they surveyed these adolescents again, remember at baseline, none of them were cigarette users. This had gone to 4.6% reporting cigarettes. And what they wanted to know is, was the use of any of these products associated with that increase from 0 to 4.6% of cigarette use at follow-up? And they found that yes, indeed it was. And this table just shows the association, and these are adjusted odds ratios, so controlling for a lot of other covariates that might account for that uptake of cigarette smoking, and found significant effects of all of these products: e-cigarettes, hookah, the other combustibles, smokeless. And then the strongest effect was for adolescents who used more than one type of other tobacco product at baseline, with that odds ratio inching up towards 4. And so the take-home points from this first study: e-cigarettes, they're the most common type of non-cigarette tobacco used by youth, and that plays out in all the prevalence data that we see. Any of these forms of tobacco, when they were used at baseline by the adolescents, were associated with greater risk of future cigarette smoking after a year. And the risk was greatest among those who used multiple products. Here's the second study I'd like to go over quickly. And again, this one looked at the role of electronic cigarette use on adolescents progressing from experimenting with smoking to becoming established smokers, published just this year in Pediatrics. So this study looked at around 1,300, again, adolescents. These are adolescents who had smoked who smoked a little bit, but less than 100 cigarettes at baseline. So that's kind of that 100 cutoff is generally used as a measure of established smoking. You have to get to 100 to be considered established cigarette smoker. Or that's just 5 packs of cigarettes. And so there was these experimenters at baseline, and then they reported their smoking behavior a year later. And they looked at 3 outcomes: whether or not they had become an established smoker of smoking 100 or more, whether they were a current smoker, and that was defined by smoking in the past 30 days, or both those, a current established smoker. They'd smoked 100 or more cigarettes, and they'd smoked recently within the past 30 days. And so this is what they found in this graph, shows the unadjusted results for those 3 outcomes. And the red bars represent the adolescents who reported ever using e-cigarettes at baseline, compared to the adolescents in the gray bars, represented by the gray bars, who had never used e-cigarettes. And so you can see in each case, ever using e-cigarettes mapped onto, at follow-up, a higher percent reporting cigarette smoking for all 3 outcomes of established smoking, past 30-day, and current established smoking. But again, these are the unadjusted results, not taking into account other kinds of covariates that might play a role in leading to smoking initiation. So here are those adjusted results. Again, with these three outcomes, and you see that the adjusted odds ratio for that first one there at 1.8, and the confidence interval not including 1 suggests that for the teenagers who were experimenters, if they used electronic cigarettes, they had a higher risk of becoming a current established cigarette smoker at follow-up. So there you have it. Among youth who had experimented with smoking, using e-cigarettes was independently associated with onset of current established smoking. So with those two studies, we're starting to see a pattern here to suggest that e-cigarette use might very well lead to increased risk of later cigarette smoking. Next couple studies I'll talk about look at a similar issue, but among college students. So a little bit older group. And this first one was published last year in the journal Addictive Behaviors, which looked at around 3,700 college students that were surveyed in 2014 and then again in 2015. And similar questions. They wanted to know, among college students who never had smoked cigarettes, did their e-cigarette use predict cigarette smoking a year later? And guess what? It did. So this table shows that among time 1 never smokers, that if they had ever used an e-cigarette, at time 2, they were significantly more likely to both ever use a cigarette and currently use a cigarette. For those who were current e-cigarette users at time 1, at time 2, they were significantly more likely to have ever used a cigarette. And again, these are adjusted odds ratio, that's the AOR, taking into account a lot of other factors that could possibly be playing a role in predicting cigarette smoking onset. So the take-home points from this study: both ever and current e-cigarette use increased the non-smoking college students' odds of trying e-cigarettes 1 year later. And ever e-cigarette use increased the non-smoking odds of current cigarette use 1 year later. Here's one more study, again with college students, looking at exclusive e-cigarette use and whether or not that predicted cigarette initiation among college students. This one was, again, just as a recent study published again in Addictive Behaviors. This one enrolled 2,500 college students from Texas, schools in Texas, who had never smoked. And they wanted to know if ever using ends increased the odds of starting to smoke after 1.5 years. And then they also wanted to know, what were the odds different between exclusive ends users and people who used ends plus other tobacco products? So was there something special about just using e-cigarettes versus using e-cigarettes and more traditional products in terms of prospective prediction of cigarette onset? And again, baseline ever using electronic nicotine delivery system was associated with a 1.36 greater odds of cigarette initiation, again, after accounting for other study variables. What was interesting, though, was that this effect was only significant among the exclusive ends users. So it didn't hold for those who used ends plus other tobacco products. And so what this suggests is that ends use there is some sort of specific unique risk factor for subsequent smoking among due to ENDS use. One more study that's a little bit different, but just came out very recently, and hits on the hot topic of juuling. This one looked at it was a little bit different, and it wasn't looking at e-cigarette use and whether or not that prospectively predicts subsequent cigarette smoking. This one was just trying to get a picture of what's going on with juul use and what are the factors associated with juul use among youth and young adults. Again, this was published just recently in the journal Tobacco Control. So this study enrolled over 14,000 participants who were, again, youth and young adults, to estimate the prevalence of juul use and the demographic and psychosocial correlates of juul use. In this study, 6% reported ever using juul, and 3.3% reported current juuling. Those numbers seem a little on the low side. However, what's alarming or should be highlighted among these in this study is this third bullet here, that if you look at it by age group, among those who were of those who were using juul, who were 15 to 17 years old, 56% reported use on 3 or more out of the past 30 days, and over a quarter of them were reporting use between 10 and 30 days out of the prior month. So that's a lot of those who are juuling, those who are doing it, they're regularly doing it. It's not just something that's a once a month kind of a thing. They also, in addition to kind of just looking at the prevalence of use, they wanted to know what factors were associated with juul use. And these were the ones that had significant associations: being younger, white race, greater financial comfort, perceiving ends as less harmful than cigarettes, household ends use, high sensation seeking, and current combustible tobacco use. And so what I think is striking about this list is that it's for most of them, it's a list of things that we're kind of concerned about. That younger youth and young adults were more likely to use juuls. That those, you have to kind of have financial resources to be able to purchase them. So this is potentially a problem that's popping up in more affluent communities. The fourth bullet down, that indeed our fears are true, that adolescents are perceiving them as less harmful than cigarettes. That the messaging that that we're delivering to adults, that it is a harm reduction technique and it's probably less harmful than cigarettes, is trickling down to our youth. And they're perhaps not hearing the messaging that nonetheless nicotine is highly addictive, and there are other negative consequences to nicotine, and the aerosols themselves may be harmful. Household ends use, that makes sense, that when other people in the household are using them, you have more access to them, and it's becomes a normatively acceptable thing to do. Teenagers who have more high sensation seeking personality characteristics are more likely to do it. And then the last one, current combustible tobacco use. And so it's concerning that they're not only using ends, they're also smoking cigarettes. And so the idea of multiple tobacco use, and we already know all of the negative consequences that come with cigarette smoking. And so it seems like a public health concern that we really do need to be worried about. So these are the take-home points. It was Juul use was higher among those less than 21. And these patterns suggest that youth may be juuling regularly rather than experimenting, and that's troubling. So taking all those 5 studies together, what are the data suggesting? That ENDS use has risen rapidly in a relatively short amount of time, looking at the data from just 2011 to 2017 and 18. The Juul is currently dominating this market. And all of these prospective studies, those 4 studies that enrolled both adolescents and young adults, do indicate, when you put them together, that ENDS use increases the risk for future onset of cigarette smoking, whether they're going from never smokers to initiators or experimenters to established smokers, that there does seem to be pretty widespread evidence across these multiple studies that the use of these products is associated with later onset of cigarette smoking. And was exactly the concern that a lot of us had about this. So the next section of the presentation is just to talk about, okay, so what are we doing about this? And specifically, what's the Food and Drug Administration doing? Recognizing that this increase over the past few years is troubling, and what these studies are starting to bear out. So a brief history, the FDA has only had regulatory authority over tobacco products at all since 2009. And so really the history of FDA in this area is relatively new. And if you know anything about FDA, they're set up on purpose to move slow, because they, as you know, they do drug approval and all of those things that we want to make sure that they take their time to get right. Well, as you can see here, it took them 7 years to move from when they were granted regulatory authority over tobacco products to expanding their regulatory authority to cover electronic nicotine delivery systems, e-cigarettes. So up until 2009, no regulation over even cigarettes, and then an additional 7 years before they got regulatory authority over e-cigarettes. And so during that time, there was a lot of variability in the products and quality control, and that's when we were having things like, them catching on fire and all kinds of crazy things. So at least in 2016, they did extend their regulatory authority to cover the products. Since then, they've done several things. In 2018, there was a rule that came out that all covered tobacco products, so that now includes ENDS, must have a nicotine addictiveness warning statement on the product packages and advertising. And this is what it says. Warning, this product contains nicotine. Nicotine is an addictive chemical. And there you just see that label on a couple of bottles of nicotine liquid that you would put into a device. They have launched, as part of their real cost tobacco prevention campaign, some e-cigarette specific messaging. And these messages focus on educating youth that using e-cigarettes, just like cigarettes, puts them at risk for addiction and other health consequences. So really e-cigarette focused prevention messaging. And you can find these advertisements on the FDA website and on YouTube and places like that. And they're putting this into the social media space to reach the target audience of adolescents in schools. there's been a lot of activity very recently in the FDA. They've placed ads in 10,000 school bathrooms and on websites about e-cigarettes. They have done some investigation into retailers selling e-cigarettes to minors, and so that resulted in 1,300 warning letters going out, and 131 of them having to pay a fine. On September 24th, the FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb announced that the FDA is considering banning online e-cigarette sales. So obviously online sales of these products is problematic and is hard to regulate. And FDA is considering pulling flavored e-cigarettes off the market. The five major nicotine vaping brands must submit a plan to FDA detailing how they'll prevent teens from using their products. And so this goes back to the issue of the flavors in the Juul pods or the other nicotine products that, these companies make the claim that their product is meant for adults who are trying to quit cigarette smoking, going back to that public health communication challenge. If that's the case, then you have to wonder about some of the flavors that they put into these products that you could argue probably are more likely to be attractive to a young person than an adult. And so the FDA is doing their job and kind of calling these companies to task over that and other issues in their marketing and saying, you need to let us know what you're going to do to prevent selling these products to teens and sticking to what you say your product is meant for, and that's the harm reduction approach.
John?
Yes.
I'm not sure if you saw, Caitlin made a comment here in our chat box about Juul in particular. I'm not sure the timing that Juul did this, but Caitlin tells us that Juul has created a prevention curriculum for schools, and they're paying schools to implement the program. So it'd be really great if those other four manufacturers, producers, would do the same. But thanks for sharing that with us, Caitlin. I thought
my point was, unfortunately, you read into it a little more and it just completely misses the mark and isn't evidence-based.
Oh.
Yeah, so we can have a little discussion about that. Philip Morris and the other tobacco companies did some similar things where, on the surface, from a PR perspective, it looked like they were doing youth prevention campaigns, but they really weren't, and so the history of if you look at the history of the behavior of these tobacco companies, you just really have to question their motives and be very careful about what they're doing and any sort of curriculum that they're providing to schools. I'd be very skeptical about it.
Thank you. And thank you all on the sidebars here, the chat here. Natalie Boyer shares that Juul officially pulled their curriculum. She saw an article within the last week. Natalie, I was going to ask you if you could send that to Caitlin and Asha upon completion of our webinar here, and we could all have that at our fingertips as well. And we could just have Caitlin send it to all of us with the evaluation link, if that would be okay.
That sounds great. And so, that kind of raises, an important point, is that this space is just constantly changing and there's constantly things going on, and it's really hard to keep up with what FDA is asking companies to do, what they're doing, and then getting criticized for doing it, and then pulling their, supposed efforts at prevention. And just as recently as November 2nd, Commissioner Gottlieb issued another statement about the FDA's efforts to address the growing epidemic. And it has to do with more funding to continue to study these issues. And he announced a December 5th public hearing to discuss FDA's efforts to eliminate youth e-cigarette use. So to FDA's credit, they are taking action and kind of talking strongly about using language like eliminate youth e-cigarette use, and taking the action that is appropriate given their regulatory authority to really address this issue that has been on the rise. And with that, we can open it up and have discussion, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
So this is, I do have one question that I kind of missed it when you were wrapping up the research section here, Dr. Macy.
Mm-hmm.
Karen asks this question, and I'm very curious about this as well. Did any of the studies question like what's really in these devices? Similar to people smoking blunts, are people putting other things in their devices, and is that ever part of the research?
Yeah, so that kind of goes back to how I started this whole thing, talking about how we how researchers ask questions about the use of these products that makes it really hard. So just that we call them different things, and so trying to capture all of the possible things, the ways the behavior could be labeled, and all the additional substances that people could be putting into the devices is really hard. And so the answer is probably no. I mean, the answer is no. So it's just getting our best guess at kind of standard use of the products. I mean, we also know that there's, which is kind of interesting, there's a whole kind of subculture of individuals who really enjoy taking them apart and tweaking them and making them do different things, and obviously putting other substances into them, marijuana, cannabis, and different things like that. So that's a great question, and I think something that is hard to get at with survey research like the studies that I presented here, and it would be something that you'd almost need more qualitative study designs to really get a deep understanding of all of the behaviors that are going on with these products.
Thank you. I do have some comments over here. There's a couple about if you are a school personnel, or if you have kids who are in school or something, and you're approached about doing any one of the brand manager or brand type prevention programs, to just contact our local or state health departments, because there are the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids do have some other prevention education programs that are evidence-based that would be appropriate for use, that are not branded by anybody. So
that's great advice.
Yeah, thanks for that comment, Marcella. And then Kelly comments about the things that are in the vapor of e-cigarettes. So I hope everybody can see that on your chat on the side. I'm not going to attempt to read I could, Aquinolite, and no, see I screwed it up, so I'm not going to try that one. But Catherine has a question. I'm actually going to follow up with Karen's question. Do the ends need to be altered in order to smoke cannabis, or can only the oil that's provided? So they can be altered. They need to be altered, and then how? I guess that's pretty simple to do.
Yeah, you can just put it in there. I mean, I was kind of saying two different things. Okay. That people alter them for a lot of different reasons, just kind of for fun, I think. And you can put oil into the cartridges. I mean, and you know, some people don't use them for nicotine at all. They just, you know, it's just a fun thing to do.
Okay.
The question above that one about actual cessation programs.
Yes.
That's exactly one of the issues that was part of the statement that came out by the FDA a few days ago. Is that there is one of the things is cessation focused on ends users. So that's something that yeah, I mean we're ill prepared to address that at this point. We kind of thought that we've handled in a lot of ways cigarette use among teenagers, and now all of a sudden this kind of came out of nowhere and surprised a lot of people, and I'd argue that we're a little bit ill prepared to do cessation with adolescents and young adults who are now all of a sudden nicotine addicted.
Mm-hmm. Marcella, I see your comment here about the Catch My Breath program. We at ASHA, we did have, I think, a link to that about a month and a half ago for folks to get information. Perhaps you can follow up with Caitlin separately. That maybe that would be a great topic for a follow-up webinar for folks who are on the line.
I would love to do that.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing that with us too.
You're welcome. Yeah, I'm busy presenting across the nation, and have been on actually the National PTA Association and some webinars and supportive with CDC and stuff. So yeah, I'll reach out to Caitlin so we can schedule something.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Caitlin, for that shout out.
Yeah.
Are there other questions about or comments about this, about the presentation today, or your experience with vaping that we would like to share with the group at this point? Oh, thanks, Mickey. And Natalie. These are great resources for folks. My question follow up to both. I know, Marcella, the Catch program that's available nationwide, correct?
Yes.
Okay. These others, the one in Michigan, Model for Health, The Power is Yours to Be Tobacco Free, and then the one that Natalie shares with Stanford Medicine. Are those available at no cost to schools? Are those only available regionally or in your states? I think that's one of the other issues that I noticed as a health educator living in Ohio. There can be really great things that are available regionally or statewide that aren't necessarily easily scalable beyond that network. So I'm just curious. I see Natalie shares Stanford is available online. Thank you for that. And Shelley, thanks for that. So did Shelley Budinsky, you asked a question about the Catch program, and Caitlin shared the link above. And I think there's going to be a group, several links along with our evaluation links later today. I see. Thanks, Mickey. So there is a cost to the Michigan program. Okay, great. Thank you. Other questions or comments for our group? If you, I'll while you're thinking about that, if you have follow-up links or resources that you come up with later in the day, if you could all just send those to Caitlin, and we'll be sure to get those either out to just this group or even on our, we have the bi-weekly School Health Action newsletter that goes out to our membership base. That would be another way to spread the news. So I wanted to remind all of you that are still here on the phone that you are eligible for a continuing education hour for CHES or MCHES, and we also do provide a participation certificate if you're of some other kind of continuing education need. If you're a member of ASHA, that is free to you. For non-members, it is $30 for an hour. All of us, in order to earn the continuing education, will need to complete the webinar evaluation, which will be emailed to you probably tomorrow. The webinar itself has been recorded and will be available on our website, ashaweb.org. So it will be available for anyone else to view and for yourself to review. And I see Caitlin has also posted the link for your evaluation if you're eager to just do it right now. That's at the bottom of our chat box. And wanted to remind you about our conference. This is the one thing we do have already on our schedule for 2019. As you just heard, there's going to be a follow-up webinar, I assume, at some point. So do be checking back to our website. We typically do about 6 to 8 webinars a year. Sometimes we've done as many as 10. And there are always issues around school health, or adolescent health and learning, or even children's health and learning. So, if you are interested in presenting, if you have something that you think would be relevant to our audience, we'd love to hear from you as well. And with that, I believe we're going to wrap it up for the day. Thank you very much, Dr. Macy, for your time and updating all of us. And thank you all for this really active participation at the end in conversations and sharing of your resources and experiences. Very helpful. Hope to see you again at another event.